Okay, so at this point, we've used the pyramid to find the raw content of our presentation. What we now need to do is think about intentionally simplifying it. Because we've now arrived at a point where we run into the most common and most toxic error that almost all presenters make, which is the fine art of fire hosing. If you're not already there, find your way to page 31. The fine art of fire hosing, you'll know what I mean by that, utterly overwhelming the audience with a gross excess of material. Absolutely hated practice, but it's one that almost all of us indulge in. Let me ask, sort of on a virtual show of hands, let me ask you a question. Have you ever been fire hosed, just on the receiving end of this huge data dump? And I'm sure most of you have. And let me ask you a question. Did you love it or hate it? You absolutely hated it. We've never found anyone who felt otherwise. But that means the second question becomes very interesting. Have you ever fire hosed somebody else? Have you ever been guilty of perpetrating this offense? And the answer is almost certainly yes. Now that's very interesting. It sets up a curious paradox. Why would it be that we do something to others we absolutely hate when we have it done to us? That's actually worth a moment. I'd like you, if you would, to just pause the video for a few seconds and think about this question, why? Why do we pack too much into our presentations? Just pause, think about it for 1 minute, and then let's come back. Okay, welcome back. I wonder what you came up with. You probably came up with some of these. Why do we pack so much in? One of them is we really want to look smart, or that we've properly prepared. That's very legitimate. I want to cover all my bases. This may be an important topic with a lot of aspects. I want to make sure I've covered all my bases. And closely related to that is maybe I want to answer all possible questions. I know what my audience cares about. I know they're going to have these questions. I need to cover all of that. Now, this one also kind of has a dark side. Maybe I don't really understand what my audience cares about. If I don't know what's important, I'm inevitably going to throw more at my audience. You didn't love my first 8 points, but you're going to love this 9th one. This is a classic that you didn't do the work to write the short letter, so you did the work to write the long one. And then something we're hearing a lot more recently is what we call the one-shot problem. We live in a very, very busy world. It's getting busier all the time. So maybe you had to wait 6, 8, 10 months to get in front of this customer or this executive. So buckle up, Bob. You're going to get everything because this is my only chance to get in front of you. Now, all you're doing really is guaranteeing you're never going to get in front of them again. But this is my only opportunity. I think when you look at this, a word that one of our clients uses as an umbrella over all of this is the word insurance. Which is, I do want to look smart. I want to cover all my bases. This is just one big insurance policy. Now, the problem here, as you can see, is these are very legitimate reasons. I do want to look smart. There are important questions. This is my only opportunity to get in front of this person. And as a result, these could be thought of as very powerful forces. They really drive us. And the problem, of course, is they drive us to absolute madness. This is a perfect example. I was at a conference and I was doing a workshop, and at the same time this other workshop was going on, and I grabbed the handout. Just for context, this is a 45 to 50-minute workshop. So let's imagine this guy had about 45 minutes to present. Look at this deck, the handout that the audience got. It's terrifying. 88 slides. Look at this. 88 slides. Dense, bulleted PowerPoints. I do the math. 88 slides in, let's say, 44 minutes. 30 seconds a slide. Roughly 5 seconds a bullet. There is no standard by which this can be thought of as good communication. He's just screaming through this. I don't even know what he tried to cover. And this was not an unintelligent person. This was an attorney. No attorney jokes, but this is an intelligent person who's committed this presentation disaster. Why? Because he's being driven by these powerful forces. In fact, if you look at this image on the screen of the pumpkin, this is just a great image of who we are often as presenters. We don't allow ourselves to be governed by any guardrails, and we just pack in an unbelievable amount of information. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, It's obviously irritating, it's disrespectful, nobody likes it. But in fact, the real problem is much bigger than that. Look at the middle of the page here. The real problem is that you're running into the cognitive limits. You're actually trampling on the cognitive limits of your audience. The audience has a finite ability to absorb information, and when you overload that limit, they shut down. Now let me explain that. This is worthy of unpacking. You see at the bottom of the page here, the inviolate principle of audience bandwidth. I think we all implicitly understand that there are limits on what people can take in, even though we almost always choose to ignore them. But let me explain what those limits really are. There's a very important phrase there at the bottom of the page, a critical concept. Your audience processes information with working memory. And working memory is extremely limited. Now let me explain that. Your brain is an amazing thing, and it has a particular a part of it which is called working memory. And working memory is essentially the first port of call for any new information. So all the information you process from your senses, what you're hearing, seeing, touching, you're using this right now in fact, comes into working memory and then is kind of sent to other places in the brain. And what we don't appreciate is just how limited working memory really is. Let me give you a mental picture of this. Imagine your brain has the total processing power of the US economy, which is roughly $17 trillion. So your brain has that much processing power. How much would you guess in dollars is assigned to working memory? So the bit of your brain that processes new information. You're probably thinking, I don't know, 1 billion, 1 million, 100 million. Well, the answer is pretty shocking. The answer is $3. $3. Terrifying. Only 3 out of $17 trillion, essentially that's just the biology of it, is assigned to processing new information. And the problem for us as presenters is that is what we're working with. We don't get as much of our audience's brain as we think. Now you might be wondering, how on earth do I even get through my day if all I have is this tiny amount of working memory? And the answer actually is very interesting. It's that most of what you do during your day uses long-term memory. Think about tying your shoes. When a kid's learning to tie their shoes, they're using working memory to do that. It's a very long process. Drives you crazy if you're trying to get out of the house. But if you tied your shoes this morning, you did it in just a matter of seconds without even thinking about it, because that process has passed from working memory into long-term memory. And that's actually how we get through the day. Most of what we do is using long-term memory. But the problem, as I said, as communicators, is you're not working with the long-term memory of your audience. You're working with their working memory. That's a problem. Which means, turn over to page 33, you see our big idea here. The brain's limits create an inviolate rule. You must stay within your audience's quantity and complexity limitations. So there's two things there, and we'll be unpacking both of those. The point I want to make here, though, is this is not a rule you can break just because you want to. Okay, because it's sort of inviolate. You cannot just overwhelm the circuits of your audience's brain. So here we have kind of an interesting collision, right? We have all these powerful forces driving us to pack everything, and we have this itty-bitty little bit of brain space to fit them into. We're sort of trying to park a dump truck in a mailbox. How do we reconcile this? Can this problem be solved? Well, of course the problem can be solved. Here's the good news. Fire hosing is not a matter of necessity. It's a matter of self-discipline. Any story can be told within the capacity of the audience's brain. You just have to have the discipline to do it. Now, how do you do that? Well, look on the page here. Here's an absolutely essential idea. The solution to this is called disciplined defoliation. Now, defoliation is kind of a fancy word for stripping stuff out. You see it defined there. It's the intentional removal of any material in your presentation that is sort of secondary or superfluous. You've got to strip out as much as you can. There's a beautiful image here. You may not recognize this guy. His name is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Pretty amazing Frenchman. It pains me to give him this much credit, but pretty amazing guy. He was a World War I fighter pilot, and he was a spy and a lover and all kinds of stuff. He's a very, very cool guy. Now, he's actually well known for writing one of the best books in history, one of the most popular books in history, called The Little Prince, which you probably heard of. But among his writings was this particularly interesting phrase, and you see it on the page there. The designer has achieved perfection, not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. That is an absolutely brilliant guiding philosophy for us, that as you're building a presentation, what you need to do is take out everything you can, not put in everything you can. Now, this is clearly not what's been modeled for us. If you've ever been on a plane and someone's working on a PowerPoint in your immediate field of view, and what do you notice as they're working? Are they adding slides or taking them away? They're adding them. Are they adding bullets or taking them away? They're adding them. And this thing that started at 5 slides and 30 bullets becomes 25 slides and 500 bullets by the end of a long plane ride. The typical behavior all of us have is to add material in the name of completeness. But what we've got to do is remove material in the name of elegant simplicity. Now, great in theory. How do you actually do it? I want to talk about how you defoliate material. I want to start with the rule, which is somewhat conceptual, and then I want to make it very, very practical for you. The rule here is called the 100 pennies rule. Now, let me explain what that means. It's well described on the page here. In preparing any presentation, imagine your audience has 100 pennies of mental energy, right? That's kind of like their stock of mental energy. And I want you to think about it this way, that everything you say and everything you show burns pennies. And when those pennies are gone, they shut down. Now, it's an interesting fact of the human brain is it sort of has to process things that you give it. So I might say, here's an interesting bit of data. It's not really that important. But the problem is the audience is still going to process it. You see that everything you say, everything you show burns pennies. And what that gets to is a vitally important phrase, which is the thoughtful designer will therefore burn pennies very sparingly. I'm going to think really hard about this finite pool of mental energy that my audience has and where I want them to expend it. Now, what I want to do, of course, is shoot for high ROI or high value. What I want to do is deliver important material that's easy for them to process. That's a great value equation. What I don't want to do is give them a long, lengthy piece of irrelevant information that burns a lot of pennies for no value. And you see that on the bottom of the page on the left and right. So what are you really looking for? What you're looking for is something like this that you see on the wall. Powerfully land a small number of big ideas. That's very valuable. That's a load-bearing idea and pretty easy for somebody to process. What you don't want is a lot of material that burns pennies for no value. This would be what we saw in one of these presentations. So this is a sales presentation, and early on you see this. A list of, a bunch of people who work at this supplier, what their job is, how many years at the company, how many years at the industry. So about 35 different data points. So here's Bob, and Bob has, 14 years with the company and 18 years in the industry, and he's got a chocolate Labrador, and he went to school at Auburn. All of this information, this company sells insurance. That information has no bearing whatsoever on whether somebody is going to buy that product from them or not. So what you want to be doing is looking for high-value material and keeping that in and take that low-value material and strip it out. Now, how do you do it? If you look at page 35, we're going to look at 35 and 37. 35 is about how you reduce quantity. So very simply, how do you just get the total quantity down, bring it down within the audience's bandwidth? 3 very simple ideas here. Number 1, critical information only. Critical information only. See, this 100 pennies rule forces you to identify what are your load-bearing ideas or insights, what's the absolutely most important data you need to support them. So the pyramid gave you a good start here, but what I want you to do is keep pressing and pushing on this. Give a great example of this in practice. I wonder if you're watching this, how many of you have seen the Disney movie Aladdin? Okay, have you seen a movie Aladdin? And this would be true actually of most Disney movies. Aladdin, the movie, runs 91 minutes. Great movie. Now, the movie is recreated on Disney Cruise Line as a live theatrical experience. Guess how long it lasts on the cruise ship? Is it 91 minutes? No. It's 47 minutes. It's half the length, literally. But what's interesting about it is it's exactly the same story, the same characters, the same plot line, the same setup, the same ultimate resolution. How did they do that? What they did was rule number one, critical information only. They focused on the main ideas and they took out sort of the secondary plot lines and the secondary characters. That's exactly what you want to do. The second rule, ruthlessly eliminate repetition. Tremendous tendency we have is to show multiple pieces of data or tell multiple stories to make the same point. Don't do that. Pick your best data, your best story, make the point, move on. Now, there's one exception to the rule of no repetition, which you see there. Repetition of insight is fine. How many times have you already heard me talk about powerfully land a small number of ideas? Lots. And you're going to keep on hearing it. Why? Because an insight or a big idea is something that's worthy of being landed more than once. And then finally, be as brief as possible. Be minimalist, concise. I love that phrase. Interesting sidebars aren't. Avoid eddies. Avoid sidebars. So often in a presentation, I'll hear a story and I'm like, that's a great story, but it was 8 minutes. That would have been a fabulous 3-minute story. Pull out what's secondary, pull out what's superfluous, focus on the main details. Now, this may raise a question with you as if we are really tightening and focusing, but we do have this question of needing to cover my bases, needing to cover important questions. How do I reconcile those two things? Well, I want you to meet your new best friend. Your new best friend is the appendix. Now, remember we saw this earlier. This is a presentation from a company called Graybar selling lighting into hospitals. Now, this is a beautiful presentation. It's tight, it's clean, and it's crisp, but it doesn't answer every secondary question. Well, guess what? This is the appendix, which is a parallel document that sits alongside this one. And this contains all of that secondary supplementary information. I want to suggest a really important idea or rule here. Almost all presenters, when they build a presentation, they design and create one document, often a slide deck. I don't like that, but it's one document. I want to suggest that almost always you want 2 documents. Always. Why? Because your primary document is the main argument, the main conversation you're trying to have with your audience. And then the secondary document is all this other stuff that you don't really need, but if it comes up, you do want to cover your bases. And by doing this, you actually look really smart twice. You send a signal to the audience that you understood what was primary and secondary, and the audiences notice that. And then you look smart a second time if they say, well, what about this? And you say, well, that's an interesting question. Look at page 11 in the appendix, and you can go there. The big value of the appendix, though, is it means all that stuff doesn't come in and distract or dilute from the core argument. And by the way, from our experience, you will tend to think that you're going to be in that appendix in every meeting, in every presentation. Well, guess what? You're hardly ever in it. There is plenty enough meat in the core presentation for you to have a great discussion without ever getting into the appendix. But this is a fantastic rule. Your new best friend is the appendix. So, summarizing all this, there's one great rule here of how to put all of this into practice, how to reduce quantity, and we call it the Jenga test. You know the game Jenga, where you pull bricks out of a tower. If the tower's still there, you carry on winning. It's basically the same thing. I want you to look at the content, the material in your presentation, and go, do I really need this? And if I took this out, would my presentation still stand? So could this company take out Bob's history and how long he was at the company and in the industry, and this presentation still stand? Absolutely. So take it out. And then eventually if you pull out something really load-bearing, you're going to know, no, that needs to be back in there. So the basic rule here is if I can take this out, is my argument still there? Another way of putting that, the phrase at the very bottom of the page is, do they really need to know this? Now that's reducing quantity. I want to close out, though, by looking at a second aspect of fire hosing, which is reducing complexity. Look over at page 37. Look at this chart. Now, I've got to ask you an obvious question. Is this chart complex? Yes, it's ridiculous, right? And I'm going to take it down because if you have it up there, then I can, smoke is going to come out of your ears and you're going to hear absolutely nothing that I'm saying. Now, it's crazy how often you do see graphics like this appearing in presentations, but that isn't the real problem, even though it does happen. The real problem is that the complexity that gets into our presentations is often not this obvious. it's more hidden to the presenter. Now, let me explain this. I want to tell you the story of a famous cognitive psychologist called Elizabeth Newton and a study that she did. It's called the Tappers and Listeners Study. So what she did is she took 300 people and she broke them into 150 pairs. And in each pair there was a tapper and a listener. And the tapper's job was to tap out 10 incredibly famous songs. So, for example, the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem. So the tapper would tap out these 10 songs, and the listener's job was to guess them. Now, let me ask you a couple of questions about this. Number one, they asked the tappers how successful they thought the listeners would be at guessing the songs. Now, do you want to guess? Did the tappers think they would do quite well or not very well? They actually thought they would do quite well. They guessed, or they thought they would get them right about 50% of the time. Bet you know where this is going. How successful do you think the listeners actually were at guessing the songs? 2% of the time. So here you have a group that thinks it's communicating 50% of the time, communicating well 50% of the time. It's actually communicating well or effectively 1 in 50 times. And then, based on my understanding of the study, guess what kind of one of the most common words the tappers would use to describe the listeners when they learned they were only getting it right 1 in 50 times? Answer, stupid. So we think we're communicating well, we're not communicating well, and we blame the audience. Very typical. Now, what exactly is going on here? This is an object lesson in communication, how it happens, or in this case, how it doesn't happen. And Elizabeth Newton coined this amazing phrase, which was, the problem that the tappers have is this: you cannot not hear the music playing in your own head. Okay? Now, this study is well documented in this marvelous book, Made to Stick, by Chip and Dan Heath. Let me read briefly to you from this book and their description of this study. And just before I do, let me do this for you. When they were asked to guess, or when they were given the Star-Spangled Banner, they would often guess Happy Birthday to You. Listen to Happy Birthday to You. It's the same. You know, what we draw from that Happy Birthday to You is the same as the national anthem, but I'll let that pass. Now, I want you to listen to what the authors say about this. The tapper's expressions when a listener guesses Happy Birthday to You for the Star-Spangled Banner are priceless. How could you be so stupid? Now, listen to the explanation. The problem here is that tappers have been given knowledge, the song title, that makes it impossible for them to imagine what it is like to lack that knowledge. When they're tapping, they can't imagine what it's like for the listeners to hear isolated taps rather than the song. This is called the curse of knowledge. Now, this is a key phrase. Once we know something, we find it hard to imagine what it was like not to know it. Our knowledge has cursed us, and it becomes difficult for us to communicate with others because we can't readily recreate our listener's state of mind. So you hear what it's saying? We now have information that's in our brains, and we have tremendous difficulty creating, if you like, the brain of the audience that doesn't have that information, which means when complexity creeps in, we don't spot it because it's not complex to us. Lovely conclusion here, which the Heath brothers draw. The Tappers and Listeners experiment is reenacted every day across the world. The tappers and listeners are CEOs and frontline employees, teachers and students, politicians and voters, marketers and customers, writers and readers. All of these groups rely on ongoing communication, but like the tappers and listeners, they suffer from enormous information imbalances. Listen to this final sentence. When a CEO discusses unlocking shareholder value, there is a tune playing in her head that the employees can't hear. This is a vitally important lesson for all communicators. You have knowledge from the field you work in, And it's not the same knowledge that your audience has. And because of that, complexity creeps in and you are likely to be totally unaware of it. But the moment your audience is confused, you have completely fractured your connection with them. So that is the fundamental problem with complexity. It's not as obvious as that crazy graph I showed you earlier. It's hidden, and it's hidden within sort of what we know and don't realize that other people don't know. So how do you combat this? Okay, look at the 3 rules on the page. Incredibly valuable. Number 1, keep everything as simple as practically possible. Intentionally simplify. Willingly sacrifice any technical content for teaching. A phrase that I love here: the conclusions from the data are more important than the details of the data. Operate again at the level of ideas. Number 2, draw the conclusions for the audience. Tell them what it means for them. Do not ask them to do the difficult job of identifying implications and applications. You may remember in the prologue, I talked about Eva Core using this great phrase. Now, why am I telling you this? This is what I was referencing. I may have some data, but I want to make sure that you understand the real point. I've got a great story for you. We were working with a financial services company. They were pitching a deal to a young software company on the West Coast. They had been told the deal was theirs to lose. They made the presentation, it's a true story, and they finished with a slide, and it was a picture of their account team. The nature of this bank was that the account team was a bunch of sort of old white guys. Well, the presentation finished, and they get the news back that they had not got the deal. And they called the company back. They had a relationship with them and said, I don't understand. I thought it was ours to lose. And the young company said, it was, and you did. And the reason you lost it, they said, was that one slide. Now, this is a great object lesson in communication. What do you think the bank had tried or was trying to communicate with the picture of the account team, these older white guys? Answer: experience. Nothing you're going to see that we haven't seen a million times. But without the conclusion being drawn, the audience was left to draw their own conclusion. What is a young software company? What conclusion would a young software company draw from seeing that picture, do you think? Out of touch, not really understanding technology, or a phrase I heard recently, stale, male, and pale. Really interesting. So here you had a piece of data, which was the account team. The intention was to communicate experience. What they communicated was out of touch. How would they have solved that? Rule 2, draw the conclusion for the audience. What they needed to do is show that picture and say, look, I know this looks like a bunch of your dad's golf buddies, but what you need to understand is there's 500 years of accumulated experience here. There is nothing you are going to see that we haven't seen before and know how to solve. What did they do? What should they have done is got it down to the level of the idea. And then finally, be careful to use audience language and be very careful with unexplained terms. You have a tribe to which you belong. You might work in HR or IT or legal or finance or sales. You have a language that is your own. And what we need to remember is the language of our tribe is not necessarily the language of any other tribe. Have you ever been totally confused by somebody from a technology company or a technology department? We have to be very careful with terminology that makes sense to us but does not make sense to anyone else. There was a study done recently in healthcare that said a majority of patients in the US do not understand what their doctor means when they say, oh, you need to hydrate. I mean, people think, like, do I need to wash more, take showers, go out in the rain? What does that mean? We have to be very careful with terms that we understand but our audience doesn't. We're working with a real estate company. This is just a residential real estate company. So they're selling to people like you and me. This was their sales pitch. And in the middle is this sort of, summary of some of their best agents. And here's the agent, how long have they been around. And in the middle it says they're a member of NAR and GAR and FAR. And I'm like, what are you guys, pirates? What does this mean? And they said, well, it's obvious, isn't it? This is the National Association of Realtors, the Georgia Association of Realtors. And the problem is they couldn't conceive that other people don't understand that. But that's because they live in the world of real estate, but a residential customer doesn't. It's incredibly easy to confuse people with terminology that's very, very clear to you, but not clear to anybody else. Now, how do you combat this? How do you solve for this problem? And I like the summary again at the bottom here. How do you reduce complexity? There are two things you need to do. One, you must do with every presentation an intentional simplification round. And what I mean is you're going through it only looking for complexity and particularly terminology that your audience might not understand. Now, you won't spot it if you're looking for typos or you're editing or proofreading. Go through and only look for complexity. And by the way, if you've worked in your field or function for more than 5 or 10 or 15 years, you are so deeply in your own song, in your own tapping, it will be incredibly hard for you to spot. And if that's the case, then the second rule comes in here, which is the untainted eyes test. It's a very valuable thing to run your presentation by somebody who does not have that immersion and that history that you have. This is actually a picture of my son from several years ago. He's 18 now, but here he is as about a 12, 13-year-old. And we were having him go through a deck from one of our clients, and we asked him to circle things that he didn't understand. It would actually have saved time if we'd asked him to circle things he did understand. Now, he's a relatively smart kid, but here is a presentation which completely confused him just from page 1 to page 20. So the untainted eyes test is very, very helpful. So, what have we said here? Your audience is not stupid, but the bit of the brain they're giving you is very limited. You get this little bit of brain called working memory, and that's the governing idea here. You've got to work within that. They're not dumb, but the amount of brain space they're giving is not very much. So you have to intentionally simplify. You've got to combat those powerful forces, and you've got to do two fundamental things. You've got to reduce quantity to keep it reasonable and realistic, and you've got to reduce complexity to keep it within their brain's bandwidth. If you do that, it will be absolutely transformative. People love a presentation that's elegantly simple, and they hate being fire-hosed. And that's all summarized in the great rule at the bottom of the page. Remember this, please. The brain's limits create an inviolate rule. You must stay within your audience's quantity and complexity limitations.